70 years since the British left India, conflict and tension still dog the issue of Kashmir. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars over the disputed territory, and a solution to the conflict appears no closer. It's just one of the legacies left behind by the British Empire, an inglorious past according to some who say colonisation was little better than theft. I'm Shuli Ghosh, and this is Insight. Hello and welcome to the programme. In August 1947, after 200 years in India, the British finally left. The subcontinent was partitioned into 2 independent nation states, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Caught between the two, Kashmir has ever since been embroiled in a territorial dispute, with India and Pakistan fighting several wars over it. And China, too, has a claim over areas in the northeast, making this small territory a big source of tension in the region. 70 years on, is a solution any closer? Insight's Yasmin Khatun Duan reports.
Today, it remains one of the most militarized zones in the world. Kashmir is no stranger to violence. For 70 years since partition, the area has been disputed by India and Pakistan, claimed in entirety by both. The nuclear neighbours have fought 3 wars, 2 of them over the control of the territory.
Kashmir is a disputed territory. It's disputed in India and Pakistan. So when we talk of Kashmir, we talk of Indian-occupied Kashmir as well as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. But right now what's happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir is that there's a lot of violence by the state against the people because people have been resisting the state. But there's also still a resilience amongst people where people are using various forms of protest, mostly non-violent protest, to challenge the Indian occupation.
India's sovereignty over the Jammu and Kashmir province has been met with continual opposition by the Muslim-majority population, with accusations by international observers that India has been using a tough-handed approach. A local man was recently used as a human shield by the Indian army, prompting international outrage.
We are extremely worried about this ongoing violence, the fact that there have been young people who have been very severely injured in these protests, the fact that the government has not yet been able to address their complaints in a way where there is a level that the violence reduces.
Extrajudicial killing, rape, including mass rape, use of mass rape as a tool of warfare. It includes blinding, right? It includes arbitrary detention. So all these forms of human rights abuses have been practiced by the Indian state in Kashmir.
India accuses the rebels of being terrorists, though the government's handling has been criticized by the leading opposition party.
The government of India and the Prime Minister of India are completely mishandling Kashmir.
More than 68,000 people have been killed in uprisings and subsequent Indian military crackdowns.
They are quite happy to even describe protesters as terrorists. And then what happens is that the security forces, when they respond, tend to go overboard.
The Hizbul Mujahideen are the largest indigenous rebel group fighting against Indian rule in the Himalayan territory. The killing of Burhan Wani, the group's leader, a year ago, sparked months of protests. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets in several places in Kashmir, chanting slogans against Indian rule and denouncing his death.
The one thing that the Indian government has always maintained is if the violence stops, then there will be room for political dialogue. Unfortunately, the violence did stop. For a long time, the violence was much reduced. And unfortunately, we did not see that kind of initiative to try and address grievances, to try and resolve human rights violations, to try and hold people accountable for the numerous abuses that had occurred in the past. And that has led to a distrust. So this younger generation that has grown up in a climate of conflict is much more distrusting of rule of law. And therefore they need to be, when they are out on the streets, they need to be convinced that they are going to get justice.
The conflict may be 70 years old, but a new generation of Kashmiris remain in search of a lasting solution. Yasmin Khatoon Diwan, reporting for Insight.
Well, let's discuss these issues further. I'm joined by military historian Victoria Schofield. She's also the author of the books Kashmir in the Crossfire and Kashmir in Conflict. Also with us is the activist Muzammil Ayub Thakur, who is the president for the World Kashmir Freedom Movement, an organisation that aims to find a peaceful political solution to the Kashmir conflict. Welcome both of you to Insight. Muzammil, let me start with you, because things seem to be the worst they've been in Kashmir for a long time. We've seen the protests growing, skirmishes along the border, attacks on Indian soldiers. It does seem to have escalated.
This isn't anything new. We've seen this quite regularly since 1947, particularly since the armed rebellion started in the late 80s. The problem is, over the last few years, Kashmiris have started to feel more victimized because of not what the reasons what the Indians would give, that people are asking for road, water, electricity and more autonomy within elections or whatever. This is something we're talking about azadi, freedom, basic fundamental rights which have been given to us by the United Nations. We have been striving consistently, peacefully. Only recently that the armed rebellion has restarted, because there comes a time in everybody's life where you can only be so peaceful for so long, and eventually young children, as young as 18, 17, 16 in fact, have taken up arms against the Indian army, against the Indian armed forces.
Victoria, there had been hopes that when Narendra Modi came to power that this is something that India would be willing to negotiate with Pakistan, but that doesn't seem to have happened. And India and Pakistan seem to be even further apart on the issue of Kashmir than they ever were.
Well, they are, and I think what we really have to make clear is that we're talking about a state that is several small localities. You refer to it loosely as Kashmir, but it's the state of Jammu and Kashmir, divided into distinct regions, and where the insurgency started really in the late 1980s is the Valley of Kashmir. But Pakistan is occupying 1/3 of the former princely state, as it was known, Gilgit-Baltistan, and a narrow strip of land which is called Azad Kashmir, Azad Jammu and Kashmir in the Pakistan side. Then you've got Ladakh, huge expanse of Ladakh, mainly inhabited by Buddhists, and then you've got the Jammu region, mainly inhabited by people of Hindu faith. So to talk about Kashmir as though it's a unified whole is actually very misleading, but it's meant that it's been much more complex to try and resolve the issue, because all of these component parts have to have some element of satisfaction with the outcome, because otherwise you'll just start another.
And therein lies the problem, and that is the big issue. I mean, you can't just make the line of control an international border, because you've got all these different cultures and backgrounds and ethnicities to deal with. So it's too glib to talk about a solution, but let's talk about some of the things that the UN have talked about. Why is there not a referendum on what the people of Kashmir want?
Well, this is a very good question. I think the Indian narrative is such that regardless of whichever party comes into power, they've always maintained that Kashmir is an integral part of India. And that goes completely against what Nehru had said, the first Prime Minister of India, when he took the issue of Kashmir to the United Nations and asked them to settle this issue. It's very simple. Offer us a plebiscite. Now, the argument in India right now is that it's been 70 years, those resolutions are defunct and obsolete. However, the Scottish have also been asking for a referendum for centuries, and we recently gave them one. Time frame is not an excuse, but I think it's also important to note that the human rights violations and the human rights laws that have been broken in Kashmir are not just in Kashmir. We have to recognize India as a rogue state, I think, now. They have recently compared themselves to Israel. The Indian media have openly called for a genocide against Kashmiris. They have openly called for an Indian Guantanamo inside Kashmir. So we can see what the mindset of India is. It isn't just about settling the Kashmir issue, it is about settling the Kashmiri people as well.
Okay, well, the UN are aware of this, because Nawaz Sharif has raised this at the UN General Assembly. Why doesn't the UN intervene in a more direct way?
Well, when we talk about the UN resolutions, they were recommendations that India and Pakistan hold the plebiscite, which both, as Muzammil rightly says, Jawaharlal Nehru and Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah had agreed. They agreed that they would hold a plebiscite following what was called temporary accession of the state to India in October 1947. And the fact that that plebiscite has never been held is the bone of contention, because many Kashmiris, and I've interviewed them myself, feel they haven't been given their right to self-determination.
Yes, they don't want to be part of India or Pakistan.
Well,
they want independence, but I mean, could it be a viable country? It doesn't have the economy, does it?
One has to ask the inhabitants whether, you cannot deny freedom to any individual and say you're not, viable as a country. It is a fact that, as I said, this area is composed of component regions which actually the inhabitants have different aspirations. They have different languages and different cultures. But the UN, when you ask me about the UN, it doesn't actually have any mandatory authority. And this is the problem. It was supposed to have supervised the plebiscite. But once one or other of those countries that agreed to hold the plebiscite decided not to hold the plebiscite, the UN has actually no authority to do so. And this is something which is sometimes misunderstood. It was not a mandatory resolution. It was recommendations as to how this plebiscite should be held.
Muzammil, presumably we need a situation where both India and Pakistan are going to back down from their posturing, which is what it's going to take, and have a negotiation. Your group wants a peaceful political solution. Does that look as though it's achievable?
Every year we anticipate things to get worse, but we don't actually understand how bad it can actually get. So post Burhan Wani, his martyrdom, no one really expected it to get to such a level where things right now, you would have another young militant, Sabzar Butt, that was also killed. These armed rebels are becoming younger and younger and younger, and they're also highly educated. So when we look for a peaceful resolution, I think we have to use the United Nations as a building block. So we talk about demilitarization. We talk about stopping propaganda against one another. And this isn't just about India against Pakistan and Pakistan against India. There is demonization against even the Kashmiri people inside Kashmir, as well as those that are studying or working in India. They're arrested if they support Pakistan in a cricket match. They are beaten, some are killed. So there is a complete demonization against not just the Kashmiris, but those that support Kashmiris. Arundhati Roy, for example, she's a great supporter. She's very famous for writing her book, The God of Small Things, and she's recently written another book. She recently, and not recently, but quite regularly talks about Kashmir and supports it. You have people like the Indian cricket superstars, politicians, actors that have openly called for her death, have openly called for her to be tied up to a jeep in Kashmir so that people can pelt stones at her. They're asking for a genocide again against somebody like Arundhati Roy. I mean, when you look at it, it's ridiculous. Arundhati Roy is the cream of the crop, is the intellectual class of India. You can only imagine how the rest of the Kashmiris are treated, inside Kashmir as well as in India.
And Victoria, you're a military historian. We know several wars have been fought over Kashmir. Does it feel as though it is escalating, that there is becoming more militancy?
I think what
Kashmir?
you're having is another generation that's disillusioned. And I've been following the Kashmir issue myself. I first went there in 1981. And so I go back a long way. And you've now got a new cycle of violence because you've got a new generation which is disaffected, which is disillusioned. I think it's imperative that all stakeholders, and one can't exclude any stakeholder, have to negotiate, because what you can have is more tension and explosion and then greater tragedy for the whole of South Asia. And so I'm an absolute proponent for dialogue, however that is achieved, whether it's a round table, a square table, no table at all. There has to be a resolution because it's too dangerous to neglect.
And that would seem to be the best way forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you both indeed very much for your time. Good to have you with us, Victoria Schofield and Muzammil Ayub Thacker. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching Insight. Coming up, living with the legacy of India's partition 70 years on. Stay with us.